The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. For many it's the greatest game ever made, for others it's the best game on the Nintendo 64, and yet for others it's simply just another entry into the Zelda series. A game which received so many perfect scores on its release and continues to be highly praised even to this day. When I wrote the foreword to the Nintendo 64 anthology book, I wrote how about the game helped shape my life, and for many of you who've subbed to this channel for years, you'll know that this game is my favourite game of all time. Many of you have commented over the years asking me when I'll eventually get around to this review, but it's always been a game which I've put off covering. Now that may sound strange coming from someone who loves the game so much, but the truth is it's always been a hard game for me to go back and play. Not because I don't enjoy it, but because as soon as I switch it on and the intro starts playing, like many of you watching, I get taken back to what was perhaps one of the best times of my life. There's a very small window between being a boy and coming of age to become a man, and the Ocarina of Time landed in that very moment in my life. It's nostalgia in its purest form, and quite honestly there's a whole ton of reviews of this game already online that will do a much better job than I ever could. However, this will be a blend of a review and a retrospective, as many of the reviews I watch these days were from people who played the game in the modern era, and they will have missed out on the years of development it underwent and what it was like waiting for the game to be released, and you possibly couldn't even fathom the expectation and the anticipation this game gathered, as it was on a whole new level never seen before in the late 90s. Now I'll also put shortcuts in the description down below for anyone who wants to jump to a specific section I'll be covering in this review, such as the sound, graphics, controls and so on. But to begin with, I'm going to be taking and talking about the development of the game and my own vivid recollections about how I finally managed to get the game. And so if you prefer to skip the sentimental nostalgia trip I'm about to lay out for you, then you may want to jump ahead later in the video. Development of the game began concurrently with Super Mario 64, and initially both games were worked using the same engine. Whilst it was always planned that Super Mario 64 would be a launch title for the console, Zelda 64 was planned to be a launch title for the N64 disk drive, which at that time was also in development. Quickly realising that the N64 disk drive discs would struggle to cope with the read speed requirements needed to run the game as intended, it was moved back to a cartridge based format, with the future aim of making the disk drive an expansion add-on. Early in development, Nintendo built the game around Ganon's castle, very much in the same light as Super Mario 64's castle. It would act as a hub world, and Link would travel to different realms in the same way. In fact, this element is still shown in final parts of the game, such as with Ganon's Phantom Spirit Temple battle. When Nintendo's skills working with the console increased, they realised that they could push the game into a much more open world feel, and scrap the hub world in Ganon's castle to create a much more expanded setting. The game was first shown in a very basic tech demo at Shoshinkai Trade Show in December of 1995. For a considerable amount of time, this short video sequence was all that us fans got to pore over. If you were lucky enough to get a VHS with a magazine back in the day, you often got to see this clip, but for anyone else you had to stick with blurry stills and magazines of this battle, which pitched an unusual looking Link against a shiny enemy. With the internet still in its infancy, getting news about the game's development often meant buying N64 magazines. Anytime they had new Zelda news, it would often be in huge letters on the front page and it would fly off shelves. With Miyamoto at the helm, the game took on a slightly unusual development process. Smaller elements of the game were broken down into teams and they had their own directors, many of whom were new to creating 3D games. There were around 5 teams to begin with, and they had an initial experimentational period, such as making prototype camera systems, scenarios, transferring 2D elements into 3D and motion capture. Whilst they're all working independently on different elements of the game, the mood at the time was said to be of true passion for creating something new and unprecedented. Miyamoto though always wanted the game to have a sense of medieval swordcraft and sorcery, but it may surprise you that the game at one stage was being tested as a remake to Zelda 2 from the NES, and would have retained the 2D style. Thankfully though that idea was scrapped, but Miyamoto also wanted to test the game being first person for its movement, but then switching to 3D for combat. Again, this idea was scrapped when the time travel story element was added to the game, as he wanted the player to be able to see the difference between the young Link and the adult Link. This was also intentionally intended to make the player visually take in more of the terrain of Hyrule, and have the developers spend more time putting focus on the environments themselves. By this point, Super Mario 64 engine had already been heavily modified to the point that it no longer bore any resemblance to the one that they had started with. With Miyamoto often coming up with new ideas not only in terms of story but how the game played, the development really began to drag a little. Miyamoto wanted to create a cinematic masterpiece at all costs, and this included the cutscenes, which were all in real time using the game's engine. This not only saved cart space as well as time rendering the cutscenes, because this would have taken much more space on the carts, and any tweaks Miyamoto wanted to make could be quickly adapted in the real-time cutscenes. This proved to be a stroke of genius, as even in the final few months of the game's development, Miyamoto was still insisting on storyline changes to help make the game flow better. As each month went by, the game's release date kept slipping, but to appease disgruntled N64 owners, more and more of the game's story would begin to appear at trade shows. Gaming events and magazines also were filled with lots of information. Every new magazine issue would have new details and information. It could be something as small as weapons or characters in screenshots, but it would also lead to huge debates amongst friends as to what they all meant. As annoying as it was that the game kept getting delayed, it was a huge amount of fun being able to discuss and dream about what the final game would be like. Things were getting critical, however. We all know that the N64 was struggling against the PlayStation, and with over 120 staff members now working on the game, Nintendo themselves knew that they couldn't afford to miss the Christmas 1998 release window. They had been billing the game for years as their equivalent to a Hollywood blockbuster, and they were fully aware that Rare had bought them much more time than they could afford to with their stellar releases, so it was now time for Nintendo to finally deliver themselves. To put it bluntly, Next Generation magazine said that Nintendo simply couldn't afford another Christmas without a real marquee title, and that Zelda was now easily the most anticipated game of the decade. After literally years of leaked information, press releases, broken promises with release dates, and seeing the game change month on month in photographs when the final release date was announced, well, very few people actually expected that Nintendo would deliver on that day. After all, even months before its promised release date, even the press themselves were still saying it was only probable that the game would actually get on store shelves by the end of '98. To give you my own personal experience, I was so sure that the game was going to get another delay until early 1999 that my brother and I didn't even put the game on our Christmas gift wish list to our parents. Instead, we preferred to make sure that we got the games that we knew were either already on store shelves or that would be on store shelves for that Christmas. We even double checked with our two local game stores in the town where he lived, and they too said that they had requested a large amount of copies of the game, but they still hadn't been told of the expected delivery shipment date. So I'm pretty sure you know what's going to happen next. The game was released here in PAL regions on the 11th of December 1998. This was 10 days after my birthday, and so I had naturally already spent my birthday money, not expecting that just a short time later the game would actually be available. Also, because of that, every single copy in the town where I lived sold out instantly. The more popular game store, which I visited every weekend, even said that for the first time in their history, they had a queue of people outside ready to buy the game from the early hours of the morning, despite the store not opening until 9 AM. This sounded crazy to me. Although I was excited for the game, it was alien for me at that time for this type of thing to happen. When you see lines like this for all the big Rockstar games these days and for any new Apple product, it was strange to think that this type of thing was happening in the small town where I lived in 1998. Despite phoning around all of the stores in the wider area, they were all out of stock, and weren't expecting to get any more copies again until January the earliest of the following year. It was always disappointing because here in PAL, we also never got the pre-order collector's edition with the special box and gold cartridge. When I went back to school after the Christmas break, I couldn't believe that I was the only one of my group of friends that hadn't managed to get the game. I was so embarrassed, in fact, I lied completely and said that I actually did get it, because I didn't want to be left out of the conversations they were having about it. Now I totally think that my friends knew it was BS, because when they were talking about specific points in the game and exchanging tips and information, I really had nothing that I could offer to the conversation, and I always had to try and blag my way through it. I just felt so gutted, after I'd been such an advocate of the game during its production, that I still didn't have a copy. I genuinely remember getting home from school some days and feeling depressed that I knew all of my friends were having this amazing adventure in Ocarina of Time and I still hadn't got it. I would get home from school and ring up all of the game stores every day, just to check if they knew when they were getting copies again, only to be disappointed when day after day they said they had no updates. It became a running joke that the game was never going to be coming back into stock. Then towards the end of January 1999, when making my daily phone call around the different game stores, my favourite store said that they didn't have any stock in, but they had just taken a delivery of N64 games which they hadn't unpackaged yet. I told him I'd wait on the line, and off he went for about 10 minutes or so before coming back on the line and telling me that they had around 50 N64 games come in, but only one copy of Zelda, which was to go to someone that was on a pre-order list that still hadn't got their copy. I asked him how many people were still on the pre-order list, and he said that about 10 people were still waiting for their copy that they had pre-ordered last year. I knew this could be my one and only chance again for weeks, and so I totally guilt-tripped him into letting me buy it from him. I poured my soul out to him about how I'd supported his business by getting new games pretty much every weekend from him, how I'd come in and pay cash for it instead of trading in games towards it, and that I would never, under any circumstances, tell anyone about him doing this favour for me. He finally caved in, and then I realised that I didn't even have the money to pay for it because I had spent all of my birthday money. Luckily for me, my old man would always keep a safe in the house with cash in his home office, and as he was still at work, I basically lifted £60 I needed and got on my skates to go up there as quickly as I could. It was a cold, wet January evening, and I remember literally dripping with sweat by the time that I went to the store to pick the game up, and there was steam literally rising off my clothes as I got into the store. Now there were other customers in the store, and I expected that some of them too were trying to get their hands on Zelda, but the store owner knew who I was and why I had come. Without a single word being said, I handed him the money and he handed me a small brown box with the game inside. It was like a narcotics deal in some backstreet crack house. In a way, this was my drug and he was my dealer. I'd become so transfixed on getting a game which I'd been building up in my mind for years that I was willing to do anything to get my hands on it, even steal from my own family, which I still regret to this day. But then the reality sunk in. How was I going to get home and play the game with my family knew that I didn't have any money to buy it, I hadn't traded in any games for it, and it had been out of stock everywhere since its launch. Crazy stories I could tell them ran through my mind on the 30-minute skate back home, but ultimately I decided to keep the game a secret. At the back of my house was a hedgerow, and I stashed the game in there so that nobody could see it, and so I could go into my house without carrying the box or having to stick it under my shirt and looking suspicious. Then when I got into my house, I checked that the coast was clear. My brother was still out and my parents were at work, and my sister was in her room, but as she was about 17 at that point, she really couldn't give a damn about what I was doing, and so I went into the back garden, eventually found the hole in the hedge where I'd stashed the game, and I took it inside. I shut my door, unsealed the box and could smell the fresh new game scent, and I finally got to start playing the game that I'd been waiting what seemed like a lifetime for. The story in the Ocarina of Time is timeless, but for the purposes of this review I'm going to assume that you've already played it, but for anyone who hasn't, there will be spoilers for the rest of the video, and so if you don't want the game completely ruining for you, it's probably best to stop watching at this point. In the deep, vast forest of Hyrule, long have I served as the guardian spirit. I am known as the Deku Tree. I don't think that there's ever been an opening to a game which is so vividly etched into my mind despite being so basic. Text is all that was needed, and the amount of backstory you are given before taking control of Link is minimal. You learn that he is the only child in the village without a fairy, so you instantly know that Link is different than the rest of the children. Of course, we know it's because he's really a Hylian and not a Kokiri, but instantly making Link an outsider even amongst his own people is something which I think many people playing the game could relate to. I'm sure at some point in all of our lives we felt different than others around us, or sometimes that we didn't quite fit in. Within moments of the game beginning, we can instantly use this to relate to the character and have that personal connection with him. Link is destined to become the hero of time, and he will bring justice and truth to Hyrule. And with Navi appointed to help guide him and his quest, it's then over to you to take control of Link and begin your adventure. The game is split into two different versions of Link. The first third or so of the game you'll be playing as young Link. As young Link, you're eased into the game, its world and the greater context of the quest. You'll have 3 small dungeons to complete to collect the spiritual stones, which will allow you to enter the sacred realm to obtain the Triforce before Ganon does. You'll find these 3 stones by completing the tasks set by the Deku Tree, helping the Gorons, and rescuing the Zora Princess. Each of these distinct races have their own existence in Hyrule, and I found this fascinating. Typically in fantasy games you'll get dwarves, elves and so on, and although you could argue that the races in Hyrule are redesigned but stick to the same character traits as the classics, that's a common theme in the Ocarina of Time, taking what would be considered classic fantasy tropes whilst giving them a modern twist for the context of the game. Whilst playing as young Link, you'll be doing dungeons on behalf of the race leaders, be this the Dodongo's Cavern for Darunia or Jabu Jabu's Belly for the Zora King. What I liked most was that when first meeting the races, they are less than welcoming, sometimes acting quite aloof against you. Sure, they're not hostile and they don't attempt to attack you, but they see your character Link as being nothing more than a small boy who couldn't possibly help them with their very serious problems. As you progress as young Link and complete their missions, they eventually become grateful and even appreciative of what you've done for them. Outside of Fire Mountain in Zora's domain, you're also pretty much free to explore the land of Hyrule. What was so fun and yet frustrating at the same time was coming across areas and secrets that you didn't quite have the right tools for, but knowing that eventually you would need to backtrack and discover them fully. Whilst the core quest can be completed in a linear pattern, you are also free to explore in true classic Zelda fashion, but sometimes hindered by your lack of equipment. Young Link was not at all a perfect experience, however. Whilst the Deku Tree dungeon gently welcomed you into 3D dungeon structure and forced you to learn the core gameplay mechanics, other parts of Young Link felt annoying. Princess Ruto, for example, in the final dungeon as young Link, left me wanting to tear my hair out. The first time you play through it, without a guide or help, you're likely to have been incredibly frustrated for many of you watching. Even entering the dungeon wasn't all that clear as it could have been, signalled to the player in better ways, because I doubt that many people would have realised straight away that you needed a bottle and a fish to get him to open his gob. But then when inside, the maze-like structure and the need to help keep Princess Ruto with you for most of it by carrying her was tiresome. On the other hand though, Dodongo's Cavern was generally an enjoyable experience and a good dungeon. It was fairly straightforward and perhaps a little too easy the first time through, but it helped with the overall good pacing of the first part of the adventure. And the overall quest and structure, as well as building the character methodically, it helped you to complete the puzzles. You could also say that young Link's side of the adventure was a much more happier affair. It was almost as if you were truly experiencing the world through the eyes of a young boy. You'd be frustrated that nobody takes you seriously, and there's enough good humour to keep a lighter tone to the game. The two most memorable funny parts of the first part as young Link were Princess Ruto's awkward marriage proposal after you rescue her, and King Darunia's wacky dance when you play the ocarina to him. As young Link, however, the game wasn't all happy at times. The first time you leave the forest after getting the spiritual stone, you're stopped by Saria. For me, this moment was perhaps one of the most important in the entire game. When you leave Kokiri Forest, it's an emotional scene for sure. By leaving the forest, Link is leaving behind his few friends and his simple way of life and everything that he's seemed to have known, to embark then on an unknown future. He's making the decision to go out into the wilder world and basically leave the safe confines of what he's always known. In the Nintendo 64 anthology book, I explained that when playing the game myself, I could see that in a way, I was doing the same thing in my own life. I was getting ready to leave behind the security and comfort of my own family life to move into the next stage as an adult. I said that it was like art imitating life, and I still feel that remains true for me personally to this day. Things take a turn, however, when Link re-enters Hyrule 7 years later as an adult. With Ganondorf now in control, the entire world seems to be much darker, both in terms of its visuals and tone. When you leave the Temple of Time for the first time as adult Link, you're now in a world of despair and anguish. When you first left Hyrule as child Link, everything seemed to be more positive, but now the world has become much bleaker. You could argue that Link's young experience in Ocarina of Time was one long tutorial ready to become adult Link where the real work starts, and you could say the real quest begins. Rauru tells you that you were held in the spirit realm for 7 years to become old enough to wield the Master Sword. There are 7 sages who are required to imprison Ganon, but 5 of them are still unaware that they are sages. You'll need to track them down and awaken them as sages. Returning to meet characters from your past as adult Link was also an interesting experience. Some of the characters, such as the Kokiri, seemingly cannot link you to being the same person they knew as a child, which was a bit far-fetched considering you're mostly in the same attire. But hey ho, for the purposes of story progression I can forget that. The passage of time also leads to some of the game's more emotive moments. Take for example the Lost Woods. When Link returns to the Lost Woods and meets Saria outside the temple to learn her song, you can sense the unspoken love between the two characters. It's a simple, childlike bond between the two of them, which you always felt would grow and become something more important later in the game. However, when the years have passed and you return to the same spot as adult Link, almost expecting Saria to still be there waiting for you, you realise that she's gone, and Sheik comes to comfort you with a piece of wisdom. It doesn't make it any easier realising that essentially the story that started in their younger days wouldn't be progressing any further in the game. It showed that for all the humorous and serious moments the game contains, it also doesn't shy away from using sadness and heartache as a tool to further engross the player. As adult Link, you'll have 5 dungeons linked to the sages that you need to awaken. As expected, you'll be traversing across Hyrule to do so, revisiting some of the areas you've already been to, but also exploring new ones for the first time. Whilst the dungeons themselves are far more complex than those of young Link, they still tend to stick to the same tried and tested formula that the series was still using at that time. And by that I mean you'll enter a dungeon, quickly acquire a new item which the dungeon will revolve around, and then after completing the dungeon, that item pretty much becomes obsolete for the remainder of the game. Now there are exceptions to this rule, but at the time of the game's release this didn't feel like too much of an issue. It's just how things were back then in the Zelda series. Of course now with the less linear Zelda experiences available, this formula seems retro, but if anything it helped you to keep progressing in the game. You knew that typically if you were stuck at a puzzle it would in some way be linked to an item acquired a short while ago. The dungeons as adult Link may be larger in scope, but it doesn't mean that they're all winners. As many people watching will agree, the Water Temple is an absolute chore and filled with a confusing mix of switches and item manipulation. I wouldn't say that the dungeon was poorly designed, but the constant entering of the item screen to change boots and equipment just basically ground the game to a halt. And I will admit that even I needed a friend who'd completed the dungeon to help talk me through it, as I was stuck at this stage for days. For every awesome dungeon as adult Link, such as the Forest Temple and the Fire Temple, there were less enjoyable ones such as the Shadow Temple. However, the addition of mini dungeons such as the Ice Cavern and the Gerudo Training Ground gave you small breaks in between the more complex tasks contained in the main dungeons. The boss battles too fall into the same pattern of needing to use an item or weapon which you've recently acquired. Essentially, it often feels like the dungeons are there to test your abilities using said weapon or item, and then the boss battle is the final test of your mastery of it. There are exceptions like Bongo Bongo, which pretty much feel like a breath of fresh air in the game, but overall I felt that the bosses were well made, albeit far too easy. Given the need to suss out their patterns, you'll then be able to quickly take them down. The game's finales with Ganondorf and then Ganon may feel it was a bit anticlimactic. I feel somewhat different about this. I remember having everything I needed to go and take the final test, but being hesitant to do so. I instead spent hours making sure that before I went to face the final boss, I went through to complete as many of these side quests, do all of the mask trades, and ensuring that I collected all items and gold skulltulas. But when I had done so, I knew that the end of my experience of the game was getting closer. It's a strange feeling. As I stood at the entrance to the castle, I was looking forward to finally completing the game, but on the other hand, I had enjoyed the game so much that I wasn't ready for it to end. I had connected with the characters and allowed myself to be drawn into the world so much that whenever I was not playing the game, all I could think about was escaping reality and playing the game again, and I didn't quite feel like I was ready to let that go at that time. Eventually though, I did what had to be done. I completed the tower challenges and stepping into the room with Ganondorf, ready for the final showdown. When the final blow was delivered to him, I felt a sense of achievement but sadness at the same time. Little did I know that the escape was still to come and the final showdown with Ganon was coming up. I don't know how I didn't know about the double boss ending to the game before reaching it, but for whatever reason I wasn't aware of it, and so it did come as a nice welcome surprise. The problem again, however, was that Ganon was easy to defeat, perhaps the easiest boss as adult Link. It's hard to explain what I felt at that moment. Despite the sense of achievement, I knew that a chapter in my life was coming to an end, not only in terms of finishing the game, which I felt had been part of my life for years after following its development, but also in my own personal life. Finally completing the game felt like the end of one chapter, but with the next phase in my life just beginning. I was disappointed that you couldn't return to Hyrule after completing the game and speaking to everyone again as the hero, but in a way I think that they did the right thing. The final battle with Ganon was just that, the end. All that I wanted was another fix to satisfy my cravings for more content in the game, which would ultimately never come. Once you've collected everything in the game and finished it 100%, then there's no reason to return. You go cold turkey and you stop playing the game. The promised Ura Zelda add-on for the disc drive never arrived, and so to this day, the game has nothing more to offer me because I've also completed the Master Quest. But for a period in early 1999, it felt like this game was my life. I can vividly remember pretty much everything in my life at that time when I was actually playing the game until the point I finished it. The story, the adventure, the friends, the challenges, the times that I spent hours seemingly passed by out of nowhere as I was playing the game, and also to times in school when I'd be daydreaming thinking about what the game would offer me next. When I look back now, however, I think it's perhaps the game's music which drew me into the game so much. Created by Koji Kondo, the game fits perfectly into the series, as he also composed the previous games at that point. This was to be the last Zelda game which he was the sole composer of. If anyone's played the game before, I'm pretty much sure that even if you just hear a piece of music from the game from any point in the game, you'll know exactly where it's from. From the opening theme to the moment that you turn the game on, every piece of music in the game is perfectly composed and the arrangements are phenomenal. What you'll most likely first notice is that the music will change dependent on your environment, and how Koji Kondo masterfully chose specific styles of music that work best within the location that you are. Take for example the area around Death Mountain. When you first visit the Gorons, the music is slow paced, almost tribal with its beats, and has a quirky overlay to it. That fits in so well with the Gorons' personalities who live there. Go a little further down the mountain and enter Dodongo's cavern, and instead the music is more environmental. You'll hear more ambient soundtrack pieces of music, and it's much darker. It fills you with a sense of gloom, and this contains many more effects which give the sense of being inside a hot volcano type area, as you'll hear quiet rumblings in the background, almost as if the whole place could explode at any moment. Then head on over to Gerudo Valley, and even if you just saw a picture of it, you'd get a feeling of a hot, dry desert town, like something that you'd see in a Spanish or Mexican village. Then guess what? The music here has a Spanish guitar flair to it. In fact, when I lived in Spain, I would often end up in these small mountain villages in the middle of nowhere, and the Gerudo Valley theme would always be the first thing that came to my mind. But it's not just the number of styles of music in the game, it's also the range. Areas like Zora's Domain with its slow, melodic and harp-like music shows that Koji Kondo really was a master of not only composing great music, but also using his music to make areas feel more alive and complete. And sometimes the lack of music is intentional for added effect. such as when the sun goes down in the game, it also basically allows you to get a greater sense of time passing in the game and also to add a bit more of a dramatic effect. It's perhaps for many, however, that the Ocarina songs themselves will be most vividly etched into your minds. If I say to you Epona's song on the Ocarina, then I'm pretty much sure that you're either hearing it in your mind right now or you've just started doing so. Likewise, if I said Saria's song, you'd be thinking of the Lost Forest theme and probably hearing the song in your own minds again. Here's why I think the songs are so memorable. Not only because they are so catchy, but they're often linked to moments in the game where you play them as parts of puzzle solving or to trigger certain events in the game. This happens so often in the game that your body releases dopamine whenever you hear these songs, which gives you a mental sensation. It's the same sensation you get when you get a text message or a notification pop up on your phone. By linking these key moments in the game to short pieces of music, they become more and more ingrained in your memory, especially as they are repeated so often in the game. The audio effects in the game are also fantastic. You all know that I love ambient music in games, and whilst it's not as frequently used here as it is in other games, the ambient effects are. Take for example when a storm begins, you'll hear the gentle patter of rain falling and thunder sometimes around you. Then when the sun rises, you'll hear nature in all its glory as birds start chirping and a gentle trickle of water as you go through the Zora's Domain stream area. To further emphasise this, the game is in surround sound, and if you have the correct audio setup, you could even hear when enemies were creeping up on you from behind. Rare were known on the console for their great surround sound work, but in Ocarina of Time Nintendo did a great job of using the rear channels so well, and it's probably the best example on the console of rear channel audio. And I think it's something that many will not yet have experienced, as few people have had the necessary equipment back in the day to be able to fully experience it. But even in stereo, the game still sounds amazing. Finishing off the sound check, however, I'll let you know my favourite audio cue in the game, which just so happens to be right at the very end. As you work your way up Ganon's castle tower, you'll hear organ music playing. It starts off quiet, but as you work your way up it gets progressively louder and louder. I always thought that this was just the general music for the area, but when you reach the top and you realise that Ganondorf was actually sat at the organ playing the music the whole time for you, I realised that the music had been intentionally implemented into the game to get that desired effect. Despite the audio department being absolutely fantastic, the graphics did a great job but couldn't quite reach the same highs. When I first played Super Mario 64, it was truly a groundbreaking moment for me. I didn't get the same jaw-dropping reaction when I was playing Ocarina of Time, but I think that was to be expected. Mario 64 was designed to be a groundbreaking moment, whereas the Ocarina of Time felt more like an evolution than a revolution. It was more of a refinement on what had been done before. Don't get me wrong though, the game is no slouch, and it's easily one of the best looking games on the platform. If one thing's true about the game, it's that it does feel like a real living world. This is not only in terms of the distinct environments and settings, but also the fact that time progresses as you play the game through the day and night cycle. Visiting certain locations at different times of day will sometimes feel like a completely new experience, which further leads you into wanting to explore all areas in the game as much as possible. Especially when embarking on the huge hunt to track down Poes or Gold Skulltulas. For example, if you take the market square in the daytime, it's bustling with activity and people going about their day-to-day business. But if you visit the market square at night time, it's calmer as pretty much everyone has left for the day and it feels like it's your own personal space. It's often said in reviews that many people first realised the huge scope of the game when they entered Hyrule Field for the first time and headed over to the castle. As you made your way there, you could see Death Mountain in the background, and at that time it looked like a distant feature. But when you soon realise that you'll actually be going there and it's a real vast mountain that you'll be working over, it really started to sink in. As the game's map started off covered, it wasn't until the quest really got going and it started to expand more and the map became unveiled to you that you'd really start to appreciate just how huge the land is for you to traverse. The level of animation in the game is also impressive. The characters and enemies in the game all moved so well for the time, and of course it looks dated by today's standards, but back then I always enjoyed seeing the many expressive ways that you could interact with the villagers, enemies and key characters in the game. Even subtle things like sun flares glancing across your screen were cool to see, even if Nintendo themselves had already used them in earlier N64 games. What stood out the most to me though were the size and scale of some of the inhabitants. Kaepora Bora, for example, was awesome to see throughout the game. I know many people found him annoying, but I personally always loved him as I really dig owls. And seeing him in a large polygon form helped make me feel really small as Link in comparison. The same too could be said for the bosses, which were enormous in size and really made you feel like you were up against the odds from a scale perspective. It helped to make your eventual victory over them feel even more epic. The downside though is that to keep things looking as they did, the frame rate is only around 20 FPS. This can lead to some slowdown during more hectic moments in the game, such as the aforementioned boss battles. But for the time, I don't really think that I ever noticed this. It wasn't until I played the game on the Nintendo 3DS, which was the 30 FPS version, that I realised just how slow the N64 version was. This also had an impact on enemy combat, because it's rare for multiple enemies to be fighting against you at the same time. Nintendo confirmed that they visited Kyoto Studio Park during a hot summer's day to get inspiration for the game, and they visited a playhouse there. This led to the Canberra style being approved to put into the game, as during the samurai play that they saw, the hero was up against many different enemies, but only one would attack the hero whilst the others looked on, almost awaiting their turn. This seemed to work perfectly in the game because it allowed the player to not be overwhelmed by a large amount of enemies that they threw at you, but also to balance out the game's swordplay, which was to be one of its core elements. It was the same theme park trip which also led to the creation of the Z targeting system. Nintendo realised in Super Mario 64 that whenever Mario needed to read a sign, it sometimes left players struggling to be in the right position to activate the read option, because the axis sometimes didn't line up perfectly. Nintendo had been trying to come up with a method to overcome this when the Eureka moment happened. Whilst watching the same samurai play taking place, one of the samurai threw a sickle and chain which the hero caught on his arm with the chain and then pulled it tight. The enemy samurai then circled around him with the chain still locked on, and this gave them the idea for the player being able to lock onto an enemy and then battle them on a one-on-one basis, being able to strafe around them. Any other enemies would not go into combat mode, they would stay in the background almost on a standby basis. Knowing that the creation of Z targeting was by pure chance on a random visit to a playhouse, and they only went to see the play to escape the heat on that hot summer's day, it was really fascinating, especially when it became a feature for so many games after this for such a long period of time. Another neat feature the game implemented was auto jumping. When I first read about this in N64 magazine back in the day, I couldn't quite get my head around about how it would work, and even when I started to play the game it really felt counterintuitive. But the more trial and error that I put into the game, it then became second nature. It's a feature which just seemed to fit perfectly into the game design, and not having jumping allocated to a button just freed up the rest of the controller for more functions. The use of a context sensitive A button was also done for the same reason. Its use will change dependent on the matter at hand, be it speaking to a character, reading a sign, making a selection, or even pushing and pulling objects. This was more refined in Conker's Bad Fur Day, but it works just as well here in Ocarina of Time. Learning how best to improve your skills does take time, and the game thankfully has mini games to help you practice and yet be rewarded for doing that at the same time. These little wins offer a welcome break from the main storyline at times, and they give you another objective if you become stuck and need some time out to think it out without being stuck on a single piece in the game for too long. When all of these elements combine, it created a game which for the time was the pinnacle of what video gaming had become. Sure, Final Fantasy VII was insanely good and I loved every moment of it, but there was, and will always be, something incredibly special for me whenever I just think about this game. It encapsulates exactly what Nintendo were able to do at that time. Create not just a great game, but an experience which still stands the test of time. It can still engage players some 20 years later, and it contained features which were the catalyst for improvements to video games as a whole. It helped further drive the industry forward. Everyone's experience and interest in a game will naturally be completely unique to them, and so I'd love for you to share your memories of what the game means to you personally. Like me, do you still consider this the best game you've ever played, and have you dreamlike memories of playing it, and were you looking forward to its release as much as I was? Or perhaps you joined the Zelda universe years later with some of the more titles like Wind Waker, Skyward Sword, Twilight Princess and Breath of the Wild, and you visited this game later after hearing and seeing so many glowing reviews of it. Or perhaps you just never really liked the game and you cannot understand all of the praise and hype that it attracts even to this day. As always, I'd love you to share your views in the comments section down below. And in the words of Sheik, the flow of time is always cruel. Its speed seems different for each person, no one can change it. A thing that doesn't change with time is a memory of younger days. As always, thanks for watching, and until next time.